We're here with our good friend, David Friedman, the former U.S. ambassador to the state of Israel, had so many diplomatic accomplishments while you're here. And you do spend a lot of time here. David, welcome back to JNS.
No, thanks, Alex. Great to be back and to be with you.
And you've come at a really interesting time. I mean, we could spend a lot of time reviewing all of the accomplishments that that you've had in the short list, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, getting the United States to help recognize Israel's sovereignty in the Golan Heights, and also the Pompeo Doctrine, which stated that settlements, Jewish communities over the Green Line, Judea and Samaria, aren't necessarily illegal according to international law.
Yeah, but there's a lot going on now, so happy to focus on the current and not to rest on laurels.
So you've come at a time where Trump administration is back in office after 4 years with the Biden administration. We saw, what happened around the world, but specifically in the region where, Israel just came under attack from Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. We're still fighting against all three of those fronts, and all of them backed by Iran, which is the head of this terror octopus, the head of the Ring of Fire. Trump administration's come in, and they've already done a lot to help Israel diplomatically, with the International Criminal Court, putting sanctions on them, taking money out of UNRWA, taking money out of the UN Human Rights Council, and basically giving backing at the United Nations, and seemingly giving Israel a green light if they want to end the ceasefire with Hamas and go back in, which we've now seen. And yet here we are. Israel's in this strange place. We've kind of restarted the aggression in Gaza, trying hopefully maybe to get to a point where we can get more hostages back. Tell me in your analysis, where do you think Israel is with regard to this war?
Well, let me first agree with you. Trump just gets an A+ for what he's done on so many levels, including domestically, fighting anti-Semitism. If we weren't looking at a circumstance where there were almost 60 hostages still held, alive and then very
maybe 24, 25 alive.
Yeah, 24, 25. I mean, hopefully more, but whatever the number is, if the situation were not complicated by the hostages, I think we would be on a very very linear path to eradicating Hamas and taming whatever is left of Hezbollah, making sure that Syria doesn't become a threat to Israel again, and of course focusing then on Iran. I think because of the hostage situation, which means so much to every Israeli. There's not an Israeli who doesn't grieve over the circumstances of the hostages, and as people have come out and described their circumstances for 400 or 500 days living in a hole, it just makes it more and more difficult. So that is the issue that makes everything, very complicated. And it is why, for example, Steve Witkoff is meeting with the Qataris and meeting with the Israelis and trying to get something done, because he understands that that this means so much to Israel and is ultimately the one item in the absence of a resolution will never be done with this war. So short of that, look, I think that where Israel is heading in the region is to a place of much greater stability, much greater relative strength with regard to its enemies. And, I'm sure we'll talk about Iran as a separate question, but I think that situation is also moving in the right direction.
We'll talk a little bit about Witkoff, and we'll get to the current events, but let's still move back several weeks, maybe 2 months back. Mm-hmm. The president said that he wanted all the hostages back by the time he came into office. And obviously there's still hostages. That hasn't happened. But there was an agreement that was reached, a phase 1 agreement. And that agreement was really authored, or a lot of the terms of that agreement were put on the table by the Biden administration back in May. And by all accounts, Israel had to release close to 2,000 prisoners that had taken during the war, plus terrorists that were in Israeli jails, many of them with blood on their hands, many of them having committed first-degree murder. And you have a lot of people in the Israeli right saying, hey, wait a second, this is a terrible deal. And Witkoff was brought in to make a deal. And Trump wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, and he likes, not only does he like deals, but he specifically likes good deals.
Mhm.
Why do you think that Witkoff came in here and pushed Israel to sign a deal, which was by many accounts considered to be a bad deal?
Look, I don't think Witkoff pushed all that hard. I mean, I think that the deal had already been agreed to by the Israeli government back in May, as you said, under Biden. So he comes in and he has the leverage of being able to say, Trump wants, action. He wants something to happen right now. And so I think he was able to jumpstart a deal, but it was unfortunately the deal that had been around since May. Now, look, I remember being asked about this when it got started, and my view, and it turned out to be correct, is that look, forget about phase two. I mean, phase two is never going to go anywhere because it would require Israel ultimately to make a deal with Hamas to end the war, and Hamas isn't making a deal unless they get to stay in Gaza.
Phase two calls for a permanent ceasefire.
Yeah, so phase two is just, but phase two gives Israel the opportunity to, under the umbrella of a ceasefire, which it could afford to engage with for a limited amount of time, under the umbrella of a ceasefire, get as many hostages out as possible. And Israel did. They got, a meaningful number of hostages freed through phase one. And so, it was worth the effort. And of course, it was going to end one day because Hamas is not going to continue with phase one without any phase two. So we're at that point. I mean, and I think, Witkoff has been trying to extend phase one. It's been difficult. His heart's in the right place. He wants to get to the right place. I don't think he's putting a particularly large amount of pressure on Israel. I think he understands that Israel cannot agree to any end of the war where Hamas is there. And I think, this distinction between, Hamas being there as a military force or a political force, I think he understands that that's just, those are meaningless words. I mean, if Hamas is there, they will be in a position to influence whoever is running Gaza, and more Israelis, unfortunately, will be killed. So that's not a good outcome. But I sort of think that, again, this is, making the best of a lousy situation. And I don't think anybody thinks it's a good deal, but, Israel places this enormous value on human life. I think more so than any other country. And it was a price Israel is willing to pay. And I think probably, notwithstanding the, the real pain that we go through releasing bloodthirsty terrorists. I mean, invariably they're going to attempt at least to kill again. This is maybe the, it's kind of, it makes, it shows both the weakness and the incredible strength of the Israeli people, right? The weakness is that they love each other too much. The strength is that they love each other so much.
Well, if you look on the streets, it doesn't always look like we love each other so much. But let's go with what you said. Obviously,
we'll get to that if you want.
We're willing to pay a tremendous price to get back our loved ones, and we cry over them every single day. And I want to get towards an interview that Witkoff did now with Tucker Carlson. But before we get to that, he said recently in another interview that Hamas and Qatar understand that there's a deadline now on renewing negotiations, getting to another either extension of phase one or some kind of other deal, which would get maybe up to half of the living hostages back in one shot, if not all of them. What do you think could happen after that deadline ends?
Look, to me, I think, everyone focuses far too much on, Trump's envoys and proxies and not enough on what Trump says. And I think people need to focus on what Trump said. Trump said the hostages are going to get released, ideally in one fell swoop, or there's going to be hell to pay. And that's the official position of the United States. Now within that rubric, can you try to make a deal? Sure. I mean, that is the right messaging to send in the context of negotiations. But at the end of the day, that is the policy of the United States. And so what I think will happen is either the hostages will be released, ideally, altogether, under a circumstance where I would assume maybe the upper echelons of Hamas, go the way of, Yasser Arafat. They're sent off into exile far away. Or I think the war just will continue to its ultimate end. And I think, as many have said, it won't be fought the same way as it was under the Biden administration. There won't be handcuffs on Israel. I think Israel's intelligence to restart this war is far better. I think, the ability to move civilians away from terrorists, again, assuming that there is such a distinction, which for the sake of argument, I'll concede, although I'm not convinced. There will be a way to fight this war more efficiently, more effectively, and more lethally than in the past. And that will be the other end. And then you go back to the other Trump doctrine, which is the U.S. will, whatever's left of Gaza will be offloaded to friendly countries. It'll take 10, 15 years, as Witkoff has said, to get rid of the unexploded ordnance and, destroy the buildings that are already halfway destroyed and rebuild it. And then, try to make Gaza into someplace not just livable, but someplace which actually, brings, commerce and opportunity to the region.
Right. Trump said in the Oval Office, who was there, maybe took Netanyahu a little bit by surprise, not only by saying that he thought that all Gazans should be resettled, whether for the short term or for the long term, but actually that America would own it. But we saw the next week, King Abdullah II of Jordan was in the White House, and nobody had smiles on their faces the way there were smiles the week before when Netanyahu was there. Egypt basically saying the border's closed, we're not taking in, the masses of Gaza. Where can Gazans be resettled, and how realistic is that?
Well, there's a lot of space in the Middle East, for resettlement. There's Sinai, notwithstanding what Egypt has said. There's Northern Africa. There's country after country along the southern Mediterranean. I wouldn't write this off. Again, everybody gets out and stakes their claim. Everybody's negotiating. As I used to say when I played basketball, everybody's working the refs. But at the end of the day, when there is a need, an immediate need to relocate 1 million or 1.5 million Arabs living in Gaza, I think it can be done. I really do. And I think that not only is that the best way to stabilize the region, I think it's the only way to really kind of prove with finality that Hamas has lost. It's the way to bring the end to Hamas, because I believe the way Hamas calibrates, victory and defeat, the way a lot of the Arab terrorist groups do, it's all territorial. It's, do we hold territory or not? When Hamas no longer holds territory, there is no longer a Hamas. And so I think that it's important for lots of reasons, to end the war and also to rejuvenate the region.
Well, you talked about holding territory, and whether Hamas holds the territory in Gaza or whether the Palestinians hold the territory in Gaza could be two separate questions. We heard that the defense minister, Israel Katz, came out with a statement over the weekend stating that if Hamas does not release remaining hostages, that Israel may consider taking pieces of Gaza and annexing them into Israel. And one of the spokespeople from the State Department basically said, it's not very helpful to be saying that. I know that you've discussed the issues of Jewish sovereignty over territories which are now controlled by Palestinians. Let's just deal with Gaza first. Do you think that Israel will ultimately, or should ultimately, be the sovereign over the Gaza Strip?
I do. And I think that I come to it from the same perspective as I came to Judea and Samaria, although Gaza is far earlier in the cycle by which, meaningful sovereignty can be asserted, because it's still a war zone. Look, the idea that Trump wants to bring real economic investment into Gaza, I think, is enormously helpful. So if you can build a couple of hotels, if you can build some apartments, again, 25 miles worth of western-facing Mediterranean beachfront, sunset-facing, it's gorgeous, right? It's the same as Tel Aviv. So there's a lot that can be made with that. But, who's going to own it? Well, whoever invests the money in a hotel or a condo, they're going to own that real estate. But
Right.
someone's got to police it. Someone's got to collect taxes. Somebody's got to, pick up the garbage. Someone's going to, exercise the municipal and government services of the Gaza Strip. That has to be Israel. I mean, nobody is going to invest $1 billion into Gaza if the municipal services are being controlled by the PA or by Hamas or by any other Arab group. It's only going to be Israel, because Israel is the only functioning country that can actually do this. So, I think, the way I interpret the Trump plan, which, admittedly is immature at this point, but the way I interpret the Trump plan is that Israel would be the sovereign, but that Israel would be the sovereign over an enormous amount of international investment, into the region that would, again, permit people to come live there, have jobs, work, play, enjoy life. And that's where I think he sees it going.
Does that include Jewish resettlement in the Gaza Strip?
I assume it includes anybody that wants to live there. I mean, to me, it would be an open area, and it would be kind of a market-driven, area for people to live.
So how far along in the total story of this war, just dealing with the Gaza Strip, how far along this story do you think we are right now?
Yeah, I think we're probably in the, maybe in the fifth inning. I think, at this point, there is no doubt who's going to win. There is no doubt that Hamas is going to lose. The question is, the terrorists, can they be effectively separated from the rest of the population? If that can be done, can you take the terrorists, either kill them, ideally, or, move them to Tunis or Algeria, wherever terrorists go when they're thrown out of their, the Middle East. And then, can you get everybody else out? Can you rebuild it? And then can you bring it back? So, I think, the most of the military stuff, I think, is coming to an end, but that's only about, half the problems. And the second half, I should say, it may be half the problem, but it's probably 90% of the time, meaning it'll take years and years and years to get there.
How impressed are you with what Israel was able to accomplish on the military level with the Biden administration in office?
Very impressed. And I think they did it with one hand tied behind their back. I mean, what's come out since Biden left office is, because now the Israeli government can speak with more candor. I mean, they were withheld, weapons that they really needed. They were pressured, to no end, not to go into places they needed to be. Obviously, the most important being Rafah, but other places as well. Of course, had they not gone into Rafah, they wouldn't have discovered the smuggling routes, out of Egypt into Gaza, which, if they don't get closed, there's no end to the war. And of course, what they did in the north is far more, breathtaking from a technological perspective. Between the pagers, killing Nasrallah, killing Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, flying into Iran, taking out all the air defense systems, coming back, being on the receiving end of 300 ballistic missiles, which no country in history has ever been targeted at one time with 300 ballistic missiles, and there wasn't meaningful damage. So, what Israel has proven is, they can defeat Hezbollah, they can clean out, they can decapitate Syria, they can defeat their enemies in Gaza, they can get to Iran whenever they want. Obviously, with the help of the United States, that's a force multiplier of 10x in terms of how much better they would be with U.S. support. So, Israel is, at great sacrifice, proving to the world that it's here to stay. It can defend itself. It can defeat its enemies. But again, it's probably a multi-year process to stabilize these areas. And one of them, we didn't talk about it, but one of the most interesting areas will be Lebanon, whether there really is maybe now finally an opportunity to empower, the non-Shiite side of Lebanon and move Hezbollah out of the way.
We saw some announcements regarding Lebanon just maybe 2 weeks ago that the United States and the new Lebanese government were beginning to engage in some kind of level of negotiations. It would seem to me, though, that that's a little bit premature, right? I mean, Israel, number one, didn't finish the job 100%. They declared a ceasefire, with a lot of people in Israel saying, why are you calling a ceasefire right now? If you keep going another 2 or 3 weeks, you'll do a lot more. We just saw it today. or over the weekend that we received a few rockets into Metula, a shot from southern Lebanon, presumably from Hezbollah. You know, why is Israel so quick to be engaging in negotiations over there?
Look, I think it's a fair point. If you look at the history of Israel, I think the one thing that stands out is, with all Israel's power and strength and ingenuity and creativity, the one thing they haven't done since 1967 is to win a war, right? And that's why, in my view, we have this ongoing, cycle of violence that keeps popping up and goes down and pops up, because Israel never wins. They just they defeat their enemies. They marginalize them. They weaken them.
They win battles.
But then the whole world comes in and says, okay, as I say in Hebrew, ad kan, we're going to get this far, but now we got to make peace. And, in 1967, they if you remember, the UN was trying to get them not to take the Golan, was trying, until the last second, Abba Eban is dancing around the Security Council. But they defeated their enemies and they held the territory. And what was, if you go to 1973, there was a circumstance that the tragedy of 1973 was not that Israel was attacked by surprise. Of course, that was terrible. But the tragedy was that, they weren't able to win the battle sufficiently decisively, and it empowered, the Arab neighbors to think they could do this again and again and again. So Israel needs to win. And I think that's why it's very important here at Gaza, where they're on the precipice of victory. They have to win this war.
Well, we see right now the Trump administration's point man on Gaza seems to be Steve Witkoff.
Yep.
Now, the president, he appointed what everybody here was calling like a pro-Israel dream team into the administration. Secretary of State Mark Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, the hopefully incoming ambassador to Israel, ambassador designate Mike Huckabee. And yet all of a sudden out of left field comes Donald Trump's golfing partner, Steve Witkoff, who by all accounts has never been a successful diplomat in his life, a successful businessman for sure, to come and be the point person regarding the negotiations with Hamas. And people are questioning his ties to Qatar. We knew that the Qataris came in and purchased the Park Lane Hotel on Central Park South for over $600 million, which was going to be like a distressed property. And Witkoff, he just did an interview with Tucker Carlson over the weekend, like a 90-minute interview, and he had only nice things to say about Qatar. Most of the people that I know in Israel, the experts, are saying that Qatar is a major part of the problem, not a part of the solution. Witkoff calls Qatar, saying that they want to be a peacemaker, and then also saying some things which I think are pretty questionable about Hamas regarding whether they are a deeply ideological movement, and then also whether they're going to have a role politically in the Gaza Strip, seeming to indicate that they definitely have to be demilitarized, but that perhaps they'll continue to reign in Gaza for a long time, and could even potentially be part of a future political solution. So, it seems like a little bit different than what some of the other members of this pro-Israel dream team in the Trump administration are saying at the same time.
Well, look, if you give a 90-minute interview to Tucker Carlson, you're going to make a lot of headlines, right? I mean, so not surprising that a lot came out of that interview. This is how I look at it. It would be easy for me to slice up that interview and slice up those issues and to be critical. And I'll tell you why I'm not going to be critical, at least not at this juncture, because I'm not in the room, because the negotiations are sensitive, because there are, almost 60, lives or bodies on the line at a very sensitive point. And because I do know Steve Witkoff. I mean, I know that in his heart, he wants to protect Israel. I know that he loves Israel. I know that he's been to Israel many times. And I know that he wants what's best. All the other stuff, I mean, if you're a diplomat, he's the good cop here. Trump is the bad cop saying, look, you make a deal or we're just going to level Gaza. Witkoff is saying, look, don't make me go back to him and say I couldn't make a deal. And in the course of this interview, he's saying nice things about essentially all the players, because he wants to keep them engaged and keep them at the table. Look, one thing I can tell you, the one thing which I know disturbed a lot of people was he said, talked about, Hamas not being ideologically intractable. I know one thing. He has no doubt about Hamas being a brutal, ruthless, horrible terror group. He's the one that brought the tape of what
Right.
Hamas did to Trump. So, I think people are misinterpreting it. What I assume he means, and I don't know, but I assume he means is that, Hamas might be willing to leave. They might be willing to leave under circumstances to give up the hostages. And, wouldn't that be nice? So again, 90 minutes, with a guy who is used to making a lot of news is going to make some news. But at the end of the day, let's let this process, run its course. You're not in the room. I'm not in the room. No one else is in the room. And, God willing, we'll see some progress with the hostages. But the idea of eradicating Hamas, sending them back to the Stone Age, I don't think he's equivocal about that. And I know, more importantly, President Trump feels that way.
But there does seem to have been some missteps with regard to the negotiations. A few weeks ago, it was reported that another special envoy, Adam Boehler, was negotiating directly with Hamas, and then did some interviews, which I think really made the problem a lot worse. And there was reports that Israelis were very upset to hear that U.S. was engaging directly with Hamas without their prior knowledge, and then basically Boehler was removed from the process almost as fast as he got into it. And in this last interview with Tucker Carlson, Witkoff basically acknowledged that Boehler went to Hamas under his permission.
Look, again, here's another guy that I know pretty well. Again, I know in his heart he loves the state of Israel. He's Jewish, and he wants to get to the right outcome. This was, I think, just, a lot of rookie errors in messaging. One thing that I learned when I was ambassador is that whatever you say, is kind of fly-specked to such an extent. Every word in this part of the world, is interpreted, and it is full of meaning, and people, draw, conclusions. You got to be careful about what you say. Now, if Adam's job is to get hostages back, that's his job. If Adam said to Witkoff, look, I got to talk to these guys because I'm getting, kind of the runaround from the intermediaries. I want to talk to them and just, and Witkoff said, yeah, go. And he had the conversation, right? And then it comes out. Okay. The right answer would be, put out a short statement. My job is to get out the hostages. I felt the need to speak to Hamas on that issue alone. This wasn't a diplomatic discussion. This was simply about the hostages. And I tried to do my best, and then end it, right? That would be it. And then nobody would have anything to say. But, you gave an interview, you gave another interview, you gave another interview. I used to say, nobody ever regrets the interview they didn't give, and I think the messaging was the problem. Yeah. I've been around this enough to understand, the substance of what people do and the messaging. He blew the messaging completely, but he doesn't in any way, it's not lost upon him, who he's dealing with, what they did, how brutal and ruthless they were. But, unfortunately, when you make those kinds of mistakes, you kind of end up in the penalty box, which is where he is.
Let's pivot a little bit. One of the fronts, which has not been the primary front, but has been quite a pesky front in this war, has been the Houthis in Yemen.
Yep.
In addition to sending ballistic missiles, I think at this point we're talking about over 175 missiles that they've sent since the beginning of the war at Israel. But they also were hijacking commercial ships traveling through the Suez Canal, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandab Straits, Gulf of Oman. They've also attacked U.S. ships patrolling the area. And the Biden administration more or less gave them a pass. There were some symbolic strikes. Certainly Israel showed the long arm of the Israeli Air Force, hitting the Hodeida port and bombing some of their power facilities and oil facilities. Now, all of a sudden, we're seeing that the United States is carrying out a pretty sophisticated attacks inside of Yemen. And at the same time, they're basically telling Iran that they're holding Iran responsible for each one of the Houthis' attacks. Where do you think this goes? How does this play out?
Bravo, to the president for doing this. Look, Biden took the Houthis off of the foreign terrorist organization designation. He had some hopes for diplomacy with them. They got to be just, wiped out, and we can do it. And America can do it, with great ease. And not only Is it important, for America to do it and for Israel and for all the ships that are going back and forth between the Bab el-Mandab and elsewhere? It's the right message to Iran. It says, guys, your proxies are basically gone. Hamas is gone. Hezbollah is gone. The Syrians, you've lost your presence in Syria. The Houthis are next, and guess what's left? You. And I think it's an easy show of force. I mean, we're going to win this battle, without question, without risking the lives, God willing, of any American troops or any Israeli troops. Get rid of the Houthis, and then the Iranians are kind of naked, and then they have to decide, what they do next. And I think it's the right step, and hopefully it gets to the right outcome with Iran.
Meanwhile, the president has stated that he's interested in seeing if any kind of a diplomatic arrangement can be put together with Iran. I mean, first of all, after all of their terror proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, proxies in Iraq and Syria, and they themselves have fired, like you said, 300 ballistic missiles. In addition, there was cruise missiles, there's drones on top of that. Why do they get the opportunity to try to negotiate their way out of this at this point?
Well, because, it's a country of, I don't know, was it 80 million people or something? And most of them are not supporters of the regime. And, it's just about the nukes. I mean, that's all it's about. And if America is in a position to project its strength in the way that Trump has been doing, and if they're able to get to a point where, Iran says, look, we'll give up our nukes, and you, not the IAEA, but you, the United States, will have free access to come and inspect and make sure that we don't have a nuclear program, not just in the places we want you to look, but everywhere else. I think Trump will do that. And I think that, I think even Netanyahu used to, when he used to complain about the JCPOA, he didn't say, we don't want a deal. He said, we don't want the wrong deal. So I think there is, again, hypothetically speaking only, there is a deal to be made. And the only way to get there is with an enormous show of strength by the United States. So we're heading in that direction, but, we're far from getting there.
I mean, how much time do we have left to wait and to let that scenario play itself out?
Not much. I mean, I think we're talking months.
And even if you talk about max sanctions, and we know the Trump administration has already placed harsh sanctions back on Iran. I mean, from the time it takes to bleed a country's economy dry, it can take many, many months. And Iran can basically, all they need to have is one deliverable nuclear weapon to change the face of the Middle East forever, right? So at what point does the president turn around and say, you know what, we're just going to take out these nuclear facilities by force anyways, and we're going to do what should have been done in the very beginning, which is get the people with their fingers on the button, the ones that have been holding the Iranians hostage for so many years, the regime itself, out of power?
Well, I think the answer to your question is that when his security staff tells him that they've hit a point of no return, I think that's the time. I don't know when that is. I'm not in the room, but I think it's all based upon the advice he gets as to when there is, at what point Iran will have a nuclear weapon.
Well, you think this is ultimately where we're headed?
I do, yes.
Now, we'll shift gears again, and you've been in Israel now for a little bit, and I guess you've noticed that there's a lot of tension on the streets. In particular, now the big thing is that the prime minister wants to fire the head of the internal security services, the Shabak, Ronen Bar, and there's a big political issue, a legal issue potentially surrounding his dismissal, and we're starting to see scenes very reminiscent of the judicial reforms protests that cropped up in the summer just before the October 7th attack. You've been involved in dealing with the upper echelons of the Israeli government, the prime minister and others. What's your take on what's going on, and whether the prime minister should be able to dismiss the head of the security services?
Well, the first thing I'd say is it's heartbreaking to see. Israel cannot afford this. I mean, I know that there are people who feel very strongly about this on all sides. It is self-defeating and self-destructive to have this kind of turmoil right now, especially at the beginning of the war. And people should really take a step back and think twice about that. I also don't think this is in any way comparable to judicial reform. which again, we won't go into a long discussion about that, but I thought that that was a much more far-reaching issue that reasonable minds could debate. Here you have the relationship between the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of the Shabak, right? It is one of the single most important relationships with regard to Israel's internal national security. That relationship must be solid, rock solid. Now, we know now that it's not, right? We know it's not. And we know that the government of Israel has the power to remove the head of the Shabak. There's no question about that. So to me, if we have a dysfunctional relationship between the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of the Shabak, and someone's got to go, well, it's got to be the head of the Shabak. Netanyahu was elected. The way you get rid of Netanyahu, for those who want to, you wait till there are elections. But until there are elections, as between the two of them, the head of the Shin Bet needs to give way. And I understand that he was already planning, to leave. So when the head of the Shin Bet no longer has the confidence of his boss, I'm at a loss to see why he's fighting to stay on. What is he fighting for? I mean, what your boss doesn't want you anymore. What are you? It's not. It doesn't make any sense to me why he's still around. He was already planning to resign. Let him resign. Now the crazy part of this, which only exists in Israel, is this idea that there is judicial oversight over the firing of the head of the Shin Bet, and it's got to be reasonable. So this, to me, as a lawyer who practiced law for 35 years, is kind of an unbearable, box for the country to be in. And you overlay that on the fact that, what will they be deciding about, reasonableness, whether or not, the Prime Minister has a conflict of interest in his firing of the Shin Bet. Okay, what's the argument for the conflict of interest? That which was created, on the day by which you would have thought the head of the Shin Bet was going to resign. He had a deadline of February 27th to submit his report, which presumably would have led to his resignation. Instead of submitting the report, he indicates an investigation of the Prime Minister's office, and that then gets bootstrapped into being the basis for a court not to permit the Prime Minister to fire the head of the Shin Bet. I mean, this to me is Orwellian. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me, for a country. I'm not talking about right or wrong, or I'm not taking sides between people, but this is a country doesn't operate this way. It just, and I think the craziest thing about this argument about a conflict of interest is the assumption that if there really is something to investigate, and maybe there is, I don't know whether or not, if there were payments from Qatar to people in the Prime Minister's office, of course, they should be looked at, and people should understand what were the circumstances and whether they give rise to, immoral activity, criminal activity, whatever it is, look into it. But the assumption that by firing the head of the Shin Bet, the rest of the Shin Bet, which is a massive organization with incredible people, skilled people, moral people, that somehow you bury an investigation of that nature just by firing the head of the Shin Bet, it's not possible. I mean, if this is real, it's going to be looked at, and there are enough people inside the Shin Bet to look at it apart from the head. So from a long-winded perspective, sorry for speaking so long, but I look at the news now and I kind of, scratch my head and say, what's going on here? I mean, we're talking about a personnel decision at the highest level. And, one of the privileges of being the boss is you get to pick the people who work for you. Okay. You don't like the boss, get rid of him at the next election, but he is the boss right now.
Right. Especially, I mean, the difference between judicial reforms versus now is that the head of the Shin Bet is part of the executive branch of the government. The head of the executive branch of the government is the Prime Minister. I worry that there is a campaign by those that are organizing street protests now against the firing of the Shin Bet that support the courts. This is, I think that there's some parallels here between the deep state in the United States that Donald Trump is fighting versus the deep state that Prime Minister Netanyahu is fighting. Netanyahu has been trying to communicate that as much as possible towards the president, I think, in the last several weeks. But there's a campaign on the left in this country to try to make the Trump administration upset at Netanyahu, recognizing that Netanyahu's biggest asset right now is the support that he has from the president of the United States to secure a total victory in this war. And they think that somehow, if they can get the president to be upset at Netanyahu and he loses this card, that he becomes much less indispensable. Do you think that the president of the United States can see through that?
Yeah, because he's going through the same process. I remember when we had the ceremony for the Abraham Accords. We were sitting, in the Oval Office before the ceremony, and we're talking about the Abraham Accords, and an Israeli reporter, on live television, lots of people watching, shoves her way through the crowd and says, asks the prime minister, Mr. Prime Minister, how much longer do you think you'll be in office, or do you think you'll be convicted of the serious crimes that have been leveled against you, blah, blah, blah. And obviously designed to embarrass him next to the president. Yeah, I thought it was a cheap shot, low blow thing to do. Now Trump just, looked at him and said, yeah, look, I got the same thing, in my country. So, Trump is going through the same thing. But look, I would say, by way of caveat though, America has much broader shoulders than Israel. We're going through a process, where the president is fighting with the courts. There's a huge amount of upheaval going on. But, we still have, the Atlantic and the Pacific as our borders, Canada and Mexico. We have the reserve currency of the world. We have the largest economy in the world. Trump can make a demand of Columbia University, which is, every student there hates him, they're still going to listen to him. The United States is still massively powerful, and nobody wants to get crosswise with Trump. I wish Israel were that powerful. It's not. It's not. And the idea that Israel can be a mini America and absorb this type of infighting, it can't. It can't. And I say that with much regret. But I've been around both countries a lot. I know both countries really well, and I think we have to be here, have a little bit more humility and make extra efforts to find common ground. I think it's more important here.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. David Friedman, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be with you as always.